September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Polish border town of Wielan. The streets are quiet, children sleep, bakeries prepare morning bread. Then the sky splits open. German Stukas scream down, sirens wailing, and within minutes the town center is an inferno. 75% of Wielan will be rubble by noon. 1,200 civilians dead. No military targets, just terror. This is how World War II begins. But here's what you've been told your entire life. That this moment was inevitable the second the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. That Germany was humiliated, crushed by reparations, and that Hitler simply rose from that resentment like a demon from wounded pride. One straight line from Versailles to invasion. That's the myth, and it's dead wrong. The real story isn't about one treaty creating one dictator. It's about something far more dangerous. A 20-year chain reaction where every time an aggressor tested the international order, the world blinked. And each time the world blinked, the next move became easier. Versailles didn't cause World War II. The failure to enforce any consequences after Versailles did. This is the story of how a system built to prevent war taught dictators that aggression paid. How each small violation that went unpunished made the next larger one feel possible. How by 1939, Hitler wasn't gambling, he was calculating. Because he'd been taught the lesson 20 times over. November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Church bells ring across Europe as the Great War finally ends. 4 years of industrial slaughter are over, 10 million soldiers dead, entire cities leveled, and in Germany something toxic is already taking root. The German army hasn't collapsed. It's retreating, yes, but in formation. Units intact, officers still commanding. And that fact, that technical detail, becomes a poison pill for the next 2 decades. Because German generals start telling a story. We weren't defeated in battle, they say. We were stabbed in the back by politicians, by defeatists, by Jews. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. It's a lie, but it's a useful lie. And in a shattered nation desperate for dignity, useful lies spread like wildfire. Germany's new government, the Weimar Republic, inherits this impossible situation. They're Democrats trying to govern a country that's been told democracy betrayed them. They're civilians blamed for a military defeat they didn't cause. But here's the question nobody asks. Why does this narrative take hold so completely? June 1919. The Palace of Versailles, outside Paris. The war's victors gather to decide Germany's fate. And yes, the terms are harsh. Germany loses 13% of its territory. All its colonies. Its army is capped at 100,000 men. No tanks, no aircraft, no submarines. And then there are the reparations. 132 billion gold marks. A sum so vast it would take decades to pay. But here's what matters more than the harshness. The inconsistency. Because while the treaty strips Germany of power, it doesn't strip any other revisionist state of ambition. It creates new countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and fills them with ethnic Germans who now want to go home. It humiliates Germany, but leaves it as Europe's largest country by population. And critically, it establishes a league of nations to enforce peace. But then the United States refuses to join. Woodrow Wilson, the treaty's architect, returns to America expecting triumph. Instead, Congress looks at Europe's blood-soaked mess and says, not our problem. Isolationism wins. The League's biggest potential enforcer walks away before it even starts. So now you have a global system with no global enforcer. You have aggrieved powers watching to see if anyone actually means what they say about collective security. And in 1923, the first test comes. Germany can't pay its reparations. The economy is in free fall. So France and Belgium decide to take payment by force. They occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers strike. The government prints money to support them. What happens next makes Weimar's legitimacy crisis exponentially worse. Hyperinflation. Imagine, you get your paycheck at lunch and sprint to the store because by dinner it'll buy half as much. A loaf of bread costs billions of marks. Life savings become worthless paper. The middle class, the foundation of any stable democracy, is wiped out overnight. This is where Hitler finds his opening, but not yet. Because in 1923, Hitler's just a fringe radical in Munich. He tries a coup, the beer hall putsch. It fails. He goes to prison for 9 months, writes Mein Kampf, emerges with a new strategy. Use democracy to destroy democracy. Build a mass movement. Wait for the right moment. And then the moment arrives. Because in October 1929, the U.S. stock market collapses. The Great Depression explodes across the Atlantic like a shockwave. Germany's unemployment explodes to 6 million. 1 in 3 workers has no job, no income, no hope. Soup kitchens stretch for blocks. And the Weimar government, already blamed for the stab in the back, already associated with hyperinflation, now looks completely powerless. This is Hitler's moment. The Nazi Party has been a fringe movement. In 1928, they won less than 3% of the vote. But now, Hitler's message finds an audience. Germany is weak because democracy is weak. We need strength. We need order. We need someone to blame. And he gives them someone to blame. By 1930, the Nazis are the second largest party in the Reichstag. By 1932, they're the largest. Hitler still doesn't have a majority, but he has leverage. Germany's parliament is paralyzed. No coalition can form. So, in January 1933, President Hindenburg makes a calculated gamble. He appoints Hitler as chancellor. The thinking, we can control him, use him, keep him in check. They're wrong. Within a month, the Reichstag building burns. Hitler blames communists and demands emergency powers. He gets them. He bans opposition parties. When Hindenburg dies in August 1934, Hitler merges the presidency with the chancellorship. He's no longer just a leader. He's the Führer. Now here's where the myth and reality split. The myth says Hitler immediately starts preparing for war, and everyone just watches. The reality? Hitler's first 3 years are about consolidation, not confrontation. He rebuilds Germany's economy. Massive public works, including the Autobahn system. Unemployment plummets. The Nazis become genuinely popular, not just among extremists, but among ordinary Germans who finally have jobs and stability. But in secret, he's also doing something else. Rearmament. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles capped Germany's army at 100,000. No air force, no tanks, no submarines. For Hitler, this isn't just a military problem, it's a test. Will anyone actually enforce these rules? So he starts small. The army triples in size quietly. Tank designs that were theoretically developed in secret cooperation with the Soviet Union in the 1920s are now built. Pilots trained in civilian glider clubs are suddenly flying military aircraft. And in 1935, he goes public. March 1935. Hitler announces the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, 2,500 aircraft, modern bombers, fighters, more planes than Britain or France. Britain and France protest, but that's all they do. No sanctions, no military response, just protest. And Hitler learns something critical. They won't stop me. 3 months later, he unveils conscription. The army will expand to 500,000 men. Again, protests, no action. Then in January 1935, the Saar region, a coal-rich area on the French border that had been under League of Nations control, holds a referendum, 90% vote to return to Germany. Hitler marches troops in. It's technically legal, but it's also a flex, a test. Nothing happens. So in March 1936, Hitler makes his boldest move yet. He sends troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone between Germany and France. This is a direct, flagrant violation of Versailles. France has every legal right to respond with force. Their military plans even have a scenario for this exact situation, but they hesitate. Why? Because France can't act without Britain, and Britain won't act at all. Here's what the British are thinking. Hitler's just moving troops into his own territory. Yes, it violates the treaty, but is it worth a war? We're still recovering from the Depression. Our military is underfunded. And honestly, maybe Hitler has a point. Maybe Versailles was too harsh. That last part, maybe Hitler has a point, is the poison that makes everything else possible. Because now the pattern is set. Hitler tests. The world protests, but doesn't act. Hitler learns. Hitler tests again. It's not one big gamble. It's a series of small, calculated moves where each success makes the next one feel safer. And in 1936, something else happens that teaches him the same lesson, but this time, it's not even about Germany. October 3rd, 1935. Italy invades Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. This should be a slam dunk for the League of Nations. Italy is the aggressor. Abyssinia is a member of the League. This is exactly what the system was designed to stop. The Abyssinian Emperor, Haile Selassie, even travels to Geneva and gives an impassioned speech begging for help. The League imposes sanctions, but not on oil, not on steel, not on anything that would actually hurt Italy's war effort. Why? Because Britain and France are terrified of pushing Mussolini into Hitler's arms. They think they can appease him, keep him neutral, so they let him win. By May 1936, Abyssinia is conquered. Italian planes drop poison gas on civilians. Entire villages are slaughtered. Mussolini annexes the country and declares a new Roman Empire. And the League does nothing. Hitler is watching all of this. Mussolini is watching. And in Tokyo, Japanese military leaders are watching too. Because 3 years earlier, Japan already ran this exact playbook. September 18th, 1931, Mukden, Manchuria. Japanese officers stage a fake attack on their own railway line and blame Chinese forces. It's a pretext, and everyone knows it's a pretext. Within months, Japan conquers all of Manchuria, a territory the size of France and Germany combined. They install a puppet emperor and rename it Manchukuo. The League condemns Japan. Japan walks out of the League. And that's it. No sanctions, no intervention. Japan is declared a pariah, but it keeps Manchuria. And Japanese leaders learn the same lesson Hitler will learn. The international system has no teeth. So in 1937, Japan goes further. Full-scale invasion of China. The rape of Nanking, 300,000 Uyghur civilians massacred in 6 weeks. Japanese planes bomb cities indiscriminately. They even sink the USS Panay, an American gunboat. 3 American sailors die. President Roosevelt wants to blockade Japan. Britain says no. Too risky. Might start a war. So Roosevelt sends China a $25 million loan instead. China fights alone. Now, step back and look at the pattern. 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. The League condemns it. Japan leaves, keeps Manchuria. 1935, Italy invades Abyssinia. The League sanctions it, barely. Italy wins, keeps Abyssinia. 1936, Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland. Britain and France protest. Germany stays. 3 aggressors. 3 violations. 3 times the international system fails to enforce its own rules. But what happens when these 3 aggressors realize they're not alone? What happens when they start coordinating? July 17th, 1936, Spanish Morocco. Army officers mutiny against Spain's elected left-wing government. Leading them is General Francisco Franco. Within days, the mutiny spreads to garrisons across Spain. Civil war. But this isn't just Spain's fight. This becomes the dress rehearsal for World War II. Because Franco immediately appeals to Hitler for help. And Hitler says yes. Why? Not because he cares about Spain. Because Spain is a laboratory. A place to test new weapons, new tactics, new doctrines. The Luftwaffe sends its Condor Legion, modern bombers, fighters, pilots eager for combat experience. Germany sends 12 Zero-Zone troops. Panzer tanks roll off ships in Spanish ports. Mussolini does the same. 50,000 Italian volunteers. 700 aircraft. And what do Britain and France do? They declare non-intervention. They actually create a non-intervention committee. Germany and Italy cynically sign the agreement, then immediately ignore it. Britain and France know they're ignoring it. And they do nothing. Stalin sends aid to the Spanish Republic, about 700 advisors, some tanks, some planes. But it's not enough. The real help comes from volunteers. The international brigades, 30 Zero-Zone idealists from around the world who travel to Spain because they see what's coming. They see that if fascism wins in Spain, it won't stop there. They're right. April 26th, 1937. The Basque town of Guernica. It's market day. The streets are crowded. Then the German bombers arrive. Wave after wave. For 3 hours, they obliterate the town. Incendiary bombs, high explosives, deliberate methodical destruction. 1,600 civilians dead. Guernica isn't a military target. It's a terror target. A test of what aerial bombardment can do to civilian morale. And the world watches. Artists like Picasso paint it. Journalists report it. Diplomats deplore it. But no one stops it. By early 1939, Franco's nationalists have won. Madrid falls. The Republic collapses. The international brigades go home, those who survive. But here's what matters. Hitler and Mussolini just ran a 3-year military exercise in Spain. They tested equipment, trained pilots, perfected tactics, and they did it all while Britain and France sat on their hands. The lesson is now carved in stone. Aggression works. So where are we by 1938? Germany has rearmed in violation of Versailles. No consequences. Japan controls Manchuria and most of coastal China. No consequences. Italy has conquered Abyssinia. No consequences. Germany, Italy, and Japan have all violated international law, and the international system has proven it will do nothing. Now Hitler is ready to move from testing to conquest. March 12th, 1938. German troops cross the border into Austria. This isn't occupation. This is annexation. The Anschluss. Austria ceases to exist as a country. It becomes part of the Third Reich. Hitler's homeland is now part of his empire. The pretext, Austrian Nazis want unification. There's some truth to that. Hitler is welcomed by cheering crowds in Vienna. But Austria's government never gets a choice. The Austrian chancellor is summoned to meet Hitler and browbeaten into submission. When he tries to hold a referendum on independence, German tanks roll in. Austria disappears overnight. Britain protests. France protests. Neither does anything. But this is different from the Rhineland. This isn't Germany taking back German territory. This is Germany absorbing another country. The rules of the game just changed. And 6 months later, Hitler changes them again. Czechoslovakia. Here's the time bomb from 1919. When Czechoslovakia was created from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 3 million ethnic Germans ended up inside its borders. They live mostly in the northwest, a region called the Sudetenland. For 20 years, it's been a political issue. Now Hitler makes it a military one. He demands the Sudetenland be given to Germany. He claims the Sudeten Germans are oppressed. He threatens war. But here's the thing, Czechoslovakia is not Austria. Czechoslovakia has a real army, 35 divisions, well-trained, well-equipped. It has modern fortifications along the German border, and it has alliances with France and the Soviet Union. If Hitler invades Czechoslovakia, he risks a real war, so he hesitates. And that's when Neville Chamberlain gets involved. September 1938. The British Prime Minister flies to Germany 3 times in 2 weeks. He's terrified that this crisis will spiral into war, so he negotiates. Hitler's demand, give me the Sudetenland, and I promise I have no more territorial ambitions in Europe. Chamberlain believes him. On September 29th, in Munich, Britain and France sign an agreement. Czechoslovakia, which isn't even invited to the meeting, is forced to surrender the Sudetenland. In exchange, Hitler signs a declaration promising peace. Chamberlain flies home waving the paper. Peace for our time, he announces. It lasts 5 months, March 15th, 1939. German troops march into Prague, not the Sudetenland this time, the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler browbeats the Czech president into putting his country under German protection. Czechoslovakia ceases to exist. For the first time, Hitler has seized territory that isn't even ethnically German. The mask is off. Britain and France finally realize what they're dealing with. This isn't about correcting Versailles. This isn't about uniting German-speaking peoples. This is about conquest. So when Hitler makes his next demand, that Poland surrender the city of Danzig and allow a German corridor through the Polish corridor, Britain and France draw a line. They guarantee Poland's independence. If Hitler invades, it means war. But Hitler doesn't believe them. Why would he? For 8 years, he's been testing boundaries. And every single time, Britain and France have backed down. He's reoccupied the Rhineland. They did nothing. He's annexed Austria. They did nothing. He's dismembered Czechoslovakia in 2 stages. They did nothing. Why would Poland be different? There's one more player Hitler needs to account for. The Soviet Union. Stalin has been watching Hitler's rise with growing alarm. Mein Kampf made it clear. Hitler sees Eastern Europe as Germany's future Lebensraum, living space. That means Poland, Ukraine, and eventually Russia itself. So in April 1939, Stalin proposes an alliance with Britain and France. Together, they could encircle Germany, contain Hitler. The negotiations go nowhere. Why? Partly because Britain and France don't trust Stalin. He's a communist dictator who's just purged his own military. Partly because Poland refuses to allow Soviet troops on its territory. They remember 1920 when the Soviets tried to invade them. They trust Russia even less than Germany. But mostly, the negotiations fail because Britain and France are negotiating in bad faith. They don't actually want an alliance. They want to signal to Hitler that one might happen. They want deterrence without commitment. Stalin sees through it, and he makes a calculation. If Britain and France won't ally with him, maybe Germany will. Think about this from Stalin's perspective. Hitler wants to expand east. France and Britain are unreliable. The Soviet Union isn't ready for war. Stalin's purges have gutted the Red Army's officer corps. He needs time. So what if... He makes a deal with Hitler. Hitler is thinking the same thing. He wants Poland. But if he invades Poland, does he have to fight a 2-front war? France and Britain in the west, Russia in the east? That's the nightmare scenario. That's how Germany lost World War I. But what if he could neutralize Russia? August 23rd, 1939. The world wakes up to stunning news. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies, bitter rivals, have signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it's just a promise not to attack each other, but there's a secret protocol. Hitler and Stalin divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland will be split between them. Stalin gets the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. He gets part of Romania. Hitler gets a free hand in Poland. And critically, he gets something else. Proof that Britain and France are bluffing. Because if Britain and France were serious about stopping him, they would have allied with Stalin. They didn't. So their guarantee to Poland must be hollow. Just more protests. More empty words. He's not entirely wrong. Let's be clear about what Britain and France are working with in 1939. Both countries are military shadows of what they were in 1918. Britain's army is tiny, designed for colonial policing, not European war. It has no modern tanks, no doctrine for mechanized warfare. The French have a larger army, but it's built entirely around defense. The Maginot Line, that massive fortification system along the German border, represents everything about French military thinking: static, defensive, reactive. Neither country is ready for offensive action. But more than that, neither country believes war is coming. Even in August 1939, many British and French leaders convinced themselves Hitler is bluffing. He won't actually invade Poland. He'll negotiate, push for concessions. Maybe another Munich-style conference. They've spent 8 years telling themselves that Hitler can be managed through appeasement, that he's a rational actor, responding to legitimate grievances. They're wrong. Let me give you the timeline of the final days. August 25th. Hitler orders the invasion of Poland to begin on August 26th. Then he postpones it. Why? Because Mussolini suddenly gets cold feet and says Italy isn't ready for war. Hitler recalculates. He doesn't need Italy for Poland, but the hesitation rattles him. August 28th. Britain reaffirms its guarantee to Poland. Hitler ignores it. August 29th. Germany issues an ultimatum to Poland. Negotiate or face war. Poland begins mobilizing. August 30th. Polish diplomats try to meet German demands. They're refused. August 31st. Hitler gives the final order. The invasion will begin at dawn. That evening, German SS troops stage a fake attack on a German radio station near the Polish border. They dress concentration camp prisoners in Polish uniforms, shoot them, and leave the bodies as evidence of Polish aggression. It's a grotesque pretext. No one believes it. But Hitler doesn't care if anyone believes it. He just needs a headline. September 1st, 1939. 4:45 a.m. German artillery opens fire across the Polish border. Stuka's dive bomb airfields, train stations, roads. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein, on a courtesy visit to Danzig, turns its guns on Polish fortifications. The Blitzkrieg has begun. Here's what makes it effective. It's not just speed, it's coordination. Panzer divisions punch through Polish lines while the Luftwaffe destroys communication networks. Polish commanders can't coordinate, can't respond. By the time they understand where the main thrust is coming, German tanks are already 50 miles deep. The Polish army fights bravely, but it's fighting the last war. Cavalry charges against tanks, static defenses against mobile armor. Within a week, the Germans are outside Warsaw. September 3rd, Britain and France finally declare war. But they don't do anything. No offensive, no invasion of Germany from the west. The French sit behind the Maginot Line. The British send a small expeditionary force to France and wait. It's called the Phony War. In Germany, they call it the Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. And then on September 17th, something happens that seals Poland's fate. The Soviet Union invades from the east. Stalin is claiming his half of the deal. Polish forces, already retreating from the Germans, now face a second front. There's no defense possible. By October, Poland has been erased from the map, split between Hitler and Stalin, just like the secret protocol promised. Britain and France are at war with Germany, but they don't declare war on the Soviet Union. Now let's go back to that myth. The myth says World War II started because the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany and made Hitler's rise inevitable. Here's why that's wrong. Versailles didn't make Hitler inevitable. The Great Depression made Hitler possible. And even then, his rise wasn't guaranteed. The Nazis were losing support in late 1932 before Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. But let's say Versailles was harsh. Let's say it created grievances. That still doesn't explain the war. Because grievances don't cause wars. Unchecked aggression causes wars. Here's the real story. Between 1931 and 1939, three authoritarian powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany, violated international law repeatedly. Each time, the international system failed to respond. Each failure made the next violation easier. Japan invaded Manchuria. No consequences. Italy invaded Abyssinia. No consequences. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. No consequences. These weren't one-off events. They were a feedback loop. Every time an aggressor tested the boundaries and faced no punishment, it taught two lessons. One to the aggressor, one to the next potential aggressor. The lesson? The system is broken. The rules don't matter. Power matters. So why didn't Britain and France stop it? This is the question that haunts history. They had opportunities. Multiple opportunities. The Rhineland in 1936. Germany's army was still small, untested. France alone could have expelled German troops with minimal resistance. Hitler himself later admitted that if France had acted, he would have had to withdraw in humiliation. But they didn't act. Why? The answer isn't cowardice. It's something more complicated. A rational fear based on trauma. World War I killed nearly 1 million British soldiers. 4 million French soldiers. Entire towns lost every young man of fighting age. The Battle of the Somme alone, one battle, 5 months, produced 1 million casualties. That's not abstract history to people in the 1930s. That's their brothers, their fathers, their sons. So when British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin looks at the Rhineland crisis in 1936, he's not just thinking about international law. He's thinking, is this worth another Somme? Is this worth another generation of dead boys? And he decides it's not. Here's his calculation. Germany is just moving troops into its own territory. Yes, it violates Versailles. But Versailles was too harsh anyway. Everyone admits that now. And if we fight over this, we might lose public support. British voters don't want war. They want jobs, recovery, peace. So Britain does nothing. France can't act alone. Their military planning requires British support. So France does nothing. And that's how Hitler learns his first lesson. They're paralyzed by fear. But there's something else going on, something deeper than fear. Britain and France are trying to preserve an empire, not project power. Think about it. Britain in 1939 controls a quarter of the world's land surface. India, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. France controls vast territories in Africa and Indochina. Maintaining those empires requires troops, ships, resources. So when crisis erupts in Europe, British and French military planners are doing grim arithmetic. If we fight Germany, what happens to India? What happens to our colonies in Africa? What if Japan takes advantage while we're distracted? What if independence movements see weakness and revolt? The British military is sized for colonial policing, not European war. France's army is built to defend French borders, not invade Germany. So appeasement isn't just moral failure, it's strategic paralysis. They're overextended empires trying to avoid any conflict that might expose how weak they actually are. And Hitler sees that weakness. But there's one more factor, one more reason the democracies fail to act. They don't believe another war is coming. Even as late as 1938, after Austria, after the Sudetenland crisis, many British leaders convinced themselves that Hitler's ambitions are limited. Neville Chamberlain genuinely believes that if Britain gives Hitler what he claims to want, there will be peace. It's not stupidity, it's hope overriding evidence. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is another world war. Another generation destroyed. And after what Europe went through between 1914 and 1918, that can't happen again. So they convinced themselves it won't. Here's where we are. By early 1939, Hitler has remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and dismembered Czechoslovakia. Mussolini has conquered Abyssinia and helped Franco win in Spain. Japan controls Manchuria and much of China. 3 aggressors, 3 expanding empires. And the international system, the League of Nations, the promises of collective security, has failed every single test. But now watch what happens when those 3 aggressors start coordinating. November 1936, Germany and Japan sign the Anti-Comintern Pact. Officially, it's about opposing communism. Really, it's about mutual support against the democracies. November 1937, Italy joins the pact. Now it's an axis. Germany, Italy, Japan. They're not formal military allies yet, but they're watching each other, learning from each other, and critically, they're timing their moves so the democracies can't respond to everything at once. Japan invades China in 1937, while Europe is distracted by Spain. Germany annexes Austria in March 1938, while Britain and France are still dealing with Japan's aggression in Asia. Hitler seizes Czechoslovakia in March 1939, right after Franco's victory in Spain. It's not coordination in the sense of a master plan, but it's opportunism that compounds. Every crisis creates distraction that enables the next crisis, and by mid-1939, the momentum feels unstoppable. Here's the thing about momentum. It creates its own logic. Hitler's generals are nervous in 1936 when he orders troops into the Rhineland. They think France might attack. They're relieved when nothing happens. In 1938, some generals plot to overthrow Hitler if he invades Czechoslovakia. They think it will trigger a war Germany can't win. Then Chamberlain gives Hitler the Sudetenland, and the plot dissolves. By 1939, the generals aren't plotting anymore. They're planning invasions. Because Hitler has been right every time. His instincts have been rewarded. Every risk has paid off. So when he says Poland will be the same, Britain and France will protest but not fight, why wouldn't they believe him? Except this time, he's wrong. Sort of. Britain and France do declare war on September 3rd, 1939, but they don't fight. The phony war lasts 8 months. French troops sit behind the Maginot Line. British forces arrive in France and dig trenches. There's no offensive, no attempt to relieve Poland, nothing. Why? Because even now, even after declaring war, they're hoping for a negotiated peace. They're hoping Hitler will stop. That Poland was the last demand. They're still playing by the old rules. Declare war, mobilize, negotiate. Hitler is playing by new rules. Strike first, strike fast, win before the enemy mobilizes. April 1940. Hitler invades Denmark and Norway. They fall in weeks. May 1940. Germany invades France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all at once. France, the great military power of World War I, collapses in 6 weeks. How did we get here? Not because of Versailles. Because every time Hitler tested the system blinked. And every blink taught him the next test would work too. So let's state the real cause clearly. World War II didn't start because Germany was humiliated in 1919. It started because between 1931 and 1939, the international community taught aggressors that aggression works. Japan invades Manchuria, and the League condemns it but does nothing. Lesson: condemnation without enforcement is meaningless. Italy invades Abyssinia, and sanctions are too weak to matter. Lesson: token resistance is the same as no resistance. Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland, and France doesn't respond. Lesson: even treaty violations go unpunished. Each lesson builds on the last. Each success makes the next gamble feel safer. By 1939, Hitler isn't taking a risk when he invades Poland. He's following a pattern that's worked 8 times already. There's a term in psychology: normalization of deviance. It means that when you tolerate small violations repeatedly, the violations stop seeming abnormal. They become the new baseline. And then bigger violations don't seem that shocking anymore. That's what happened between 1931 and 1939. The first violation, Japan in Manchuria, was shocking. The League of Nations spent months debating it. Commissions were sent, reports were written. It was treated as a crisis. But when nothing happened, when Japan kept Manchuria without consequence, the next violation was less shocking. By the time Hitler marches into Prague in March 1939, it barely makes headlines for more than a day. Of course he did. That's what dictators do now. The deviance has been normalized. And here's the terrifying part. It wasn't just normalized for the aggressors. It was normalized for everyone. British voters in 1938 aren't demanding war over Czechoslovakia. They're relieved Chamberlain avoided it. French citizens aren't protesting their government's inaction. They're grateful. Because the alternative, standing up to Hitler, enforcing consequences, means war. And after 20 years of being told that war must never happen again, that anything is better than war, populations have been conditioned to accept retreat. The peace movement of the 1920s and 30s was morally right about World War I being a catastrophic waste, but it created a strategic blind spot. It taught an entire generation that all wars are equally bad, that any compromise is better than fighting, that the real evil is war itself, not the things war might be fought to stop. So when Hitler offers Chamberlain a piece of paper in Munich, Chamberlain waves it as proof of peace. Not because he's naive, but because the British public desperately wants to believe that piece of paper means something. They want to believe the system can still work, that negotiations still matter, that international law still matters. But international law without enforcement isn't law, it's wishful thinking. Now let's talk about what makes 1939 different from 1914. In 1914, World War I started because of a chain reaction no one fully controlled. An assassination in Sarajevo triggered alliances, mobilizations, ultimatums. It escalated faster than diplomacy could contain it. 1939 is the opposite. World War II doesn't start because of an accident. It starts because of a calculation. Hitler looks at the evidence. Japan has been at war in China for 2 years. Britain and France did nothing. Italy conquered Abyssinia. Britain and France did nothing. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. Britain and France did nothing. Germany absorbed Austria. Britain and France did nothing. Germany dismembered Czechoslovakia twice. Britain and France did nothing. 8 precedents. 8 times the democracies chose not to fight. So when Hitler plans the invasion of Poland, he's not gambling that Britain and France won't declare war. He's gambling that even if they do, they won't actually fight. And for 8 months after September 1939, he's right. The phony war proves his instincts were sound. Britain and France declared war, but they're not fighting. They're waiting, hoping, looking for an exit. Hitler uses those 8 months to consolidate his position, finalize plans for the Western offensive, and prepare the knockout blow. By the time France falls in June 1940, the war is already over in the West. Britain survives only because of the English Channel, and none of it was inevitable. That's the core of the myth. The inevitability. The idea that once Versailles was signed, everything that followed had to follow. That Hitler was destiny. That the war was written in 1919. But history doesn't work that way. Versailles created grievances. The Depression created desperation. Those things made Hitler possible. But Hitler didn't make the war inevitable. The war became inevitable when the international system proved it wouldn't stop him. Let me show you the exact moment when the path to war became locked in. Not 1919 at Versailles. Not 1933 when Hitler took power. Not even 1936 in the Rhineland, though that was close. September 30th, 1938. Munich. Here's why. Munich wasn't just another failure to act. It was Britain and France actively rewarding aggression. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland under threat of war. Chamberlain and French Premier Edouard Daladier gave it to him in exchange for a promise. But that promise, no more territorial demands in Europe, was the poison. Because when Hitler broke that promise 5 months later by seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia, he proved that promises meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. Agreements meant nothing. All that mattered was power. And once that lesson was learned, by Hitler, by Mussolini, by Stalin, by the German generals, by the world, the logic of the system collapsed completely. Why would Hitler stop at Poland? He broke his promise about Czechoslovakia with no real consequence. Britain and France declared war, but they didn't fight. Why would he stop at France? He'd proven that blitzkrieg worked, that the democracies couldn't respond to speed. Munich was the moment when appeasement turned from a strategy into a trap. Because once you've rewarded aggression, you've taught the aggressor that more aggression will be rewarded. And once you've signaled you won't fight, proving you will fight requires a much larger crisis. Poland was that larger crisis. And even then, even with declarations of war, Britain and France still didn't fully commit. The phony war was 8 months of hoping the problem would go away. It didn't. So here's the real answer to what started World War II. Not one treaty, not one grievance, not one dictator. A system that promised collective security but delivered collective paralysis. A pattern where every unpunished aggression made the next one more likely. A series of democracies that chose short-term peace over long-term security until the choice was no longer theirs to make. The myth says Versailles caused the war. The truth is that the failure to enforce Versailles and every treaty, rule, and norm that followed caused the war. Let's go back to where we started. September 1st, 1939. Wheeling, Poland. The first bombs of World War II fall on a town with no military value. Just civilians, just terror. The Luftwaffe pilots dropping those bombs aren't thinking about the Treaty of Versailles. They're not thinking about reparations or the humiliation of 1918. They're following a tactical doctrine perfected in Spain. They're using weapons tested in Manchuria by their Japanese allies. They're executing a blitzkrieg strategy that assumes the enemy won't respond effectively. Because for 8 years, no enemy has. That's what 20 years of unpunished aggression looks like in practice. Not an inevitable explosion of historical grievance, a calculated military operation built on learned behavior. Here's the lesson that took 50 million deaths to learn. Deterrence doesn't come from promises. It comes from credibility. Britain and France promised to uphold the Treaty of Versailles. They promised the League of Nations would maintain peace. They promised collective security. But when Japan invaded Manchuria, they didn't act. When Italy invaded Abyssinia, they didn't act. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, they didn't act. Each failure made the next promise less credible. By 1939, Hitler didn't believe their guarantee to Poland because he had 8 years of evidence that their guarantees were empty. And he was almost right. Britain and France did declare war. But the phony war showed that even a declaration of war didn't mean they'd fight to win. They were still hoping for a diplomatic exit, still hoping Hitler would stop on his own. He didn't stop. He invaded Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. By June 1940, Germany controlled Western Europe. And it happened not because Versailles was too harsh, but because the enforcement of international order was too weak. There's a counterfactual worth considering. What if France had sent troops into the Rhineland in March 1936? Hitler later admitted he would have withdrawn. German forces in the Rhineland were under orders to retreat if met with resistance. Hitler's generals were terrified France would respond, but France didn't. And that single moment of inaction taught Hitler the lesson that shaped everything after. They won't stop me. One show of force in 1936 might have prevented the annexation of Austria in 1938, which might have prevented the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, which might have prevented the invasion of Poland. We can't know for certain. History doesn't offer controlled experiments, but we do know this. By 1939, stopping Hitler required a world war. In 1936, it might have required only a battalion. That's the cost of appeasement. Not that it delays war, but that it makes war bigger when it finally comes. The myth about Versailles is seductive because it offers a simple story. Germany was punished too harshly. That created resentment. Resentment produced Hitler. Hitler started the war. It's clean. Linear. One cause, one effect. But reality is messier. Yes, Versailles created grievances. Yes, the Great Depression created desperation. Yes, those conditions made extremism possible in Germany, but they also made extremism possible in Spain, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania. A dozen countries had economic catastrophes and political instability in the 1930s. Most of them didn't invade their neighbors. The difference wasn't the severity of the grievance. It was whether the international system punished expansion or rewarded it. Japan expanded and was rewarded with territory. Italy expanded and was rewarded with territory. Germany expanded and was rewarded with territory. By 1939, aggression had become the rational choice. That's what the myth misses. It treats World War II as an eruption of historical forces, inevitable, uncontrollable. But it was a choice, a series of choices, made by aggressors who learned that aggression worked and by democracies that learned that avoiding confrontation was easier than accepting costs. Until the costs became unavoidable. 50 million people died in World War II. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. 20 million Soviet citizens. Hundreds of thousands in bombing campaigns in Germany, Japan, Britain, entire cities obliterated. How many of those deaths could have been prevented if the Rhineland had been contested in 1936? How many if Abyssinia had been protected in 1935? How many of Manchuria had been a red line in 1931? We can't know the number, but we know the principle. Small aggressions unpunished become large aggressions inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles didn't start World War II. The failure to mean what it said did. The League of Nations didn't start World War II. The refusal to enforce collective security did. Appeasement didn't start World War II. But it taught the dictators that nothing would. September 1st, 1939, German bombs fall on Wheeling. That moment wasn't 20 years in the making because of a treaty signed in 1919. It was 8 years in the making, built from every test that went unanswered, every boundary crossed without consequence, every promise broken without cost. Versailles didn't make the war inevitable. The world's response to everything after Versailles did. The myth says history forced Hitler's hand. The truth is that 20 years of inaction freed it.